The Catholic Church wants to reinvigorate itself, wants to in China, whereas the Communist Party has no interest in reinvigorating Catholicism, right? They don't want to reinvigorate a religious group. So you have fundamentally opposing interests in this deal. And I think this is sort of the fundamental problem in it.
Hello, my name is Carrie Kazel. I'm an associate professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame, and I am delighted to be joined today by Ian Johnson and Francisco Sisi to discuss the complex relationship between the People's Republic of China and the Holy See. Briefly, as our bios can be found on the National Committee website, allow me to introduce our guests. Ian Johnson is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, researcher, and 2024-2025 fellow at the Berlin Institute of Advanced Study. Francisco Sisi is an Italian journalist, scholar, and longtime Beijing resident who was the first Vatican-approved reporter in China. He currently serves as the director of the Appia Institute. All right, let's get to it. We'll start with you, Ian. Could you give us a broad overview of the current landscape of religion in China? How has the Chinese government approach to religious groups evolved over the years? What do you see as the key challenges to religious communities and challenges they're facing today?
Well, if you want to take the really broad perspective, after the PRC was founded in 1949, there were 5 religious organizations that were approved. That would be Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, and then for administrative purposes, Christianity is considered almost as 2 religions, Protestantism and Catholicism. That lasted for less than a decade until the sort of late 50s when Mao went off on a series of what they call leftist excesses, when most religious life was driven underground, especially culminating in the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 76, when Mao died. So after Mao dies, the reform era starts under Deng Xiaoping. They try to revive the old system. They do that, but they also acknowledge that in addition to the official religious groups, that there are unofficial religious groups. And a key document in the early 1980s really lays that out and says, especially in regards to Christianity and Catholicism, that underground churches are to be tolerated. And the overall view is that this will eventually die away because we're socialists after all. We believe that people will move toward a communist paradise with no need for religion. Religion is sort of the opiate of the masses, but we're not going to force it like we did in the Mao era. And I think to the surprise of the party, religion exploded in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. Most religious groups grew very quickly, and the exception to that might be Catholicism. We could get into that a bit later. But the party, I think, starting in the 2000s, began to realize, not just in relation to religion, but in civil society in general, that maybe things had gone a little bit too far. And they began to think of ways to rein in these independent organizations, including NGOs and so on. And it really does predate Xi Jinping, but maybe Xi Jinping's a convenient sort of turning point in 2012. And then starting in the 2010s, you have a new law, for example, on NGOs, and you have a new law on religion that eliminates some of the ambiguity that religious groups had used in their favor. And so this freewheeling era, the same kind of freewheeling era we saw in the economy and other aspects of Chinese society like that in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, that comes to an end.
Mm, let me just follow up really quickly, Ian, about Christians in China and specifically Catholics. Do you think Christians and Catholics face more scrutiny compared to other religious groups or even other civil society groups that you mentioned?
Yeah, I do. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that Christians are unlike Muslims, let's say, who are often defined as part of different ethnic groups. Christians are overwhelmingly Han Chinese, and this sort of challenges the idea that there is a thing called Chinese culture that is based on Confucianism and basic sort of moral principles that could be vaguely drawn to this amalgam of Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and these kinds of things. The kinds of things that the CCP, especially under Xi Jinping, is pushing today under the rubric of traditional Chinese values. And so Christianity doesn't necessarily stand in conflict with Confucianism, let's say, but it is a challenge to the idea that a monotheistic Abrahamic religion is un-Chinese because we have this growth of Christianity among Han Chinese. And I think that makes it a little bit different. They do face persecution similar to Muslims in that sense, in that the party, I think, feels that it's easier to control Buddhism and Taoism. Buddhism, maybe the exception being Tibetan Buddhism, but basically Han Chinese Buddhism, Taoism, folk religion, traditional values, that's something the government feels more comfortable with. But the Abrahamic faiths, for different reasons, are a challenge to its worldview and how it would like to organize society.
That's great. Thank you. Francisco, let's bring you into the conversation, and perhaps you can talk about the Vatican. For our audience, which may or may not be aware, do the PRC and the Vatican have formal diplomatic relations? And how do you characterize this relationship? Has it changed over time?
No, they don't have formal diplomatic relations, but there are channels of communications. That is, the embassy in Rome, the Chinese embassy in Rome, serves also as a platform for communication with the Holy See. And there are visits, both of Chinese delegations to Rome and Vatican delegations to China to discuss relevant issues. So they are in a mixed situation. The Vatican would like, of course, to normalize, not of course, but this is complicated, to normalize diplomatic relations, would like to open an office in Beijing, some kind of representative office, just like maybe the United States had before the full normalization of ties in 1980. But Beijing has been very reluctant to move forward, has been very, very cautious. But Ian raised an interesting point about the difference of Abrahamic religions and the Confucianist society. But here there is also something which is true, but here there is also something in movement. That is, China is trying to rethink, in part of it, of course, to rethink its history. So now there are studies dating back the arrival of Christianity to the Tang Dynasty. In fact, we have a Tang Dynasty still of the 7th century AD. And then it was the first wave of Christianity. At that time, there was also Zoroastrianism and Mithraism that came to China. And then there was the second wave, Jesuits, who came to China and also contributed greatly, at least officially. So I think I would say things are not so close, I would say, for Christianity. There is more interest also in what I would say cultural Catholicism. That is, people who are not Catholics, but are interested in Catholicism, in the cultural entity. And there were a lot of people interested in the Pope Francis tweets, which had, of course, a Chinese translation, and there were millions of people following Pope Francis tweets. So, you know, maybe a little bit of a nuance here in the situation, if I may.
No, thank you. Thank you for adding to this. Francisco, maybe you mentioned Pope Francis, and as you know, the impetus for this program was the death of Pope Francis in some ways, and the subsequent re-election of a new Pope, Pope Leo XIV. I wanted to hear your thoughts. Do you think this transition in leadership for the Church will have an impact on the bilateral relationship between China and the Vatican? As you know, we're about in the first 100 days of Pope Leo, so it's a honeymoon period. But have there been any early signals or hints as to how he might approach relations with Beijing? Maybe coming from his background, he's an American Pope, or at least we certainly claim him, his theological leanings, his inaugural message?
I think there were two messages. I don't know, they are not coming from the Pope and also from China. That is, during the time of when Pope Francis had died, but the conclave hadn't started yet, there was an announcement about the selection of a bishop. And this announcement was quite controversial. It was unclear if it was actually selected by Beijing first or what the hell had happened. Both sides actually, after the election of the Pope, selected and announced this new bishop. What happened in the situation? That the process for the selection of bishops is pretty complicated and takes a long time. And at a certain stage, the final stages, everybody knows who is going to be the bishop, but they're waiting for the final announcement, which will be made by the Pope. So Pope Leo decided to announce this bishop was selected by him and was therefore anointed by him. So this was an important sign of continuity. And then there was a second sign of continuity from the Chinese. The Chinese was supposed to have a delegation coming in the summer, maybe in the summer, maybe in October. But since Pope Francis had died, first they thought maybe we should postpone it, look at the situation, wait a little bit, see what he comes. But then eventually the Chinese decided, well, you know, let's give a sign, a positive sign. And so the delegation came actually in June. So I would say the first indications, at least the first indication, are of strong continuity, both from the Vatican and from China. That doesn't mean that they will have an improvement of ties anytime soon. I think the Chinese are very happy how things are standing and are concerned with so many things. I don't think they have the bandwidth to consider improving ties even further with the Vatican, which is so complicated, and they are out of their depth there.
Right. So thank you. Sounds a lot of continuity, status quo, perhaps. Ian, I wanted to ask you, since Francisco brought up the appointment of bishops, as you know, this has been a real sticking point in the relationship. Could you walk us through, maybe unpack a little bit the situation of Catholic bishops in China? Why have the Vatican and Beijing disagreed over appointments for so many decades? What does this process look like?
Let me maybe just back up and say why I think this deal, why the church wanted to do some kind of a deal to begin with. Like, why did it get into this situation? So there was a situation, there's the patriotic Catholic Church, and then you have the underground Catholic Church. And for many pious Catholics in China, depending on the area in China, it was hard to feel that you were worshiping properly if you were going to the patriotic church. So many went to the underground church, not uniformly. It varies quite a bit by region. But I would say overall that what this led to over the past 75 years was a stagnation for the church in China. Now, these numbers are extremely rough, but you know, the best set of figures are, in 1949, there were roughly 1 million Protestants and 3 million Catholics. The number of Catholics today, there are various numbers. The Holy Spirit Study Center in Hong Kong, their numbers, and these are 10 years old, but it was that there are maybe 10 to 12 million, which only sort of tracks population growth over the past decades, whereas the number of Protestants has sort of exploded. And I think one of the reasons for this is that, to be generous, you could say that Protestantism is a hierarchically light religion. I mean, I went to many churches where the person basically just memorized the Bible, you know, and then became a pastor and had a few people in his living room. And before you know it, had 20 people, and then had a mega church. I read in one of my books, I wrote about this guy who had hundreds of people. And so you could do this if you were a Protestant, but you couldn't do this if you were Catholic. And for historical reasons also, the Catholic Church was stronger in rural areas Rural China's emptying out, and the church wasn't nimble enough organizationally to be able to sort of capture the Catholics as they're moving to the big cities. And part of it is because of the structure, and that there was a real deficit in the number of bishops. I don't know how many dozens of bishops are basically bishoprics are basically empty, but there are a large number. So I think the church, from the church's point of view, they felt that some sort of a deal was probably necessary, and that this was worth a try. And now, a decade later, one could debate about whether this has worked or not. But I think the key point, the key sticking point, is who appoints the bishops, because of the importance of bishops in the Catholic Church, in appointing priests, and you can think of it in the Chinese context as analogous to in Tibet, where you have religious slash political positions that are absolutely important and which the party wants to control. And similarly, they want to control the appointment of bishops, but the Catholic Church can obviously, for very important theological reasons, not allow this to happen. And so you had this tension. It went on for decades and decades, and this is an effort to solve it. But I think maybe the issue for many people in the church would be whether, as I understand it, and here, please, Francisco, correct me, but is this actually working? Or is this logjam and the lack of bishops actually being addressed? Or is it still just being 2 or 3, 4 or 5 being appointed every year, when really you'd need to have 10 or so appointed every year to sort of break this logjam? And I think that's where the interests in the two parties in a deal are so different. The Catholic Church wants to reinvigorate itself, wants to in China, whereas the Communist Party has no interest in reinvigorating Catholicism, right? They don't want to reinvigorate a religious group. So you have fundamentally opposing interests in this deal. And I think this is sort of the fundamental problem in it.
No, thank you. Just to follow up, so as you know, in 2018, this deal was signed, the provisional agreement on bishops' appointments. However, the deal remains secret, except for the very few insiders. So in your sense, and Francisco, please feel free to jump in on this, what indicators should we be looking at from the outside, or even for Catholics on the ground in China, to judge whether or not this agreement is succeeding or failing?
That may be something where Francisco can talk about that, because I'm not sure, except to see the number of bishops who are being appointed, where I think the net results are underwhelming, but there are other factors to consider too, probably. So,
no, it's true. Ian is right. The results on the appointment of bishops is underwhelming. It's well below what the Vatican feels necessary. There are different numbers. I mean, there are. Let's say there should be scores of new bishops appointed, and now we are maybe a dozen that have been appointed since 2018. So the Chinese are dragging their feet, and yes, I would say the Communist Party doesn't want to reinvigorate the Catholic faith on the one hand, but there are also some I would say technicalities, which are not just technicalities. That is, the appointment of the bishops in the Catholic Church is done by the Pope. So the Pope appoints officially. It doesn't happen every time in every country, but for China it does, because it's so important. So, because there are about 3,000 bishops, active bishops worldwide. So, but in case of China, then if the Pope looks at appointment of bishops, so should Xi Jinping, because it should be equal status. But Xi Jinping's agenda is so full, and he doesn't really know and doesn't, I would say, care about it. So the mechanics becomes complicated. Plus, there is no will, because I think you characterized Kerry very well. I mean, there is continuity, but status quo. And for the Communist Party, the stress is on the status quo. They don't want to rock the bottom. They don't want to improve the situation. They don't want to worsen the situation. So they keep on having a few appointments every year. But they know the Catholic Church is very complicated, potentially extremely dangerous, disruptive. So they are very, very cautious. And there is also another point, not only bishops, but the dioceses. Ian was right. I mean, the movement of people from the countryside to the city was an important element. Therefore, some dioceses are to be redrawn. Now, who is redrawing the borders of these dioceses? Now, you know that this thing is very important, because in each diocese the bishop can order priests around. So, according to the borders of the dioceses, you give or take away power from a bishop. And third, I would say there is a lack of priests. There are not many priests, not many vocations. And so there are very few people you can draw from. There are more nuns, but they help, and they come to Rome. They go to the United States for training. Some of the nuns are excellent. Some do work, but you have a basic lack of priests to draw from.
Yeah, sounds like there's not a strong pipeline or a really dense pipeline, and so that makes it challenging in so many ways. Another contentious point, Francesco, and complicated point is Taiwan. And the Vatican, as you know, is the only European state that formally recognizes Taiwan. In your sense, why has the Holy See maintained this recognition and for so long? Are there potential triggers that might cause the Vatican to switch its recognition to Beijing?
In fact, I think that the situation is just the opposite. As I was mentioning before, the Vatican would be ready to have formal relations with China anytime. And I remember Pope Wojtyła already said that in the 90s. So it's not something that is new at all. But China doesn't want it. China doesn't want an embassy in Beijing, a Vatican embassy in Beijing. I would say maybe for two reasons. One, because that would cause an upheaval in Taiwan, because Taiwan would feel very isolated, and then it could push people to call for total independence and have embassies all over the world. And also another element, which is internal for China, if you have an embassy, a Vatican embassy in Beijing, that embassy would be very different from any other embassies. I mean, other embassies serve as a liaison office between a foreign country and whatever the Chinese government wants to do or doesn't want to do. But this embassy would actually serve some Chinese people in China. So how can you manage this embassy that is so different from all other embassies? And how can you manage the expectations of people who are Catholics or self-proclaimed Catholics? Because that is also another important element. So you might have people who have complained and have problems coming to Beijing, knocking at the embassy door and saying, well, I have this problem, I have this other problem. There is already an issue with thousands of letters written directly to Rome in every language, in English, Italian, French, even Latin, of course, Chinese, to Rome, complaining for whatever or denouncing whatever happens to China. And a cardinal once told me that they know more about the situation in China than maybe of any other country, because the Chinese Catholics are so active and write to the Vatican so much. So if you have an embassy, Beijing would be, the Chinese government would feel, you know, a little bit uneasy about it.
Right. Well, it is a very complicated situation. So thank you for helping unpack that. Francisco, but also for you, Ian, beyond the contentious issues of appointment of bishops and Taiwan as a flashpoint, what do you see are the Vatican's larger goals of engaging in China? Do you see those as primarily pastoral, a political, combination of both?
My impression, but I want to hear Ian's impression, is that they are mainly pastoral, I mean, there is a bigger picture, I would say, the geopolitics of Catholicism. If you take the Philippines out of the picture, you have that in Asia, Catholics are maybe 2-3% of the total population. But here there is 60% of the global population. So if you don't invert the trend, Catholicism could become less important in a future world, because also economic and political development is happening in Asia. And where do you develop? I mean, India, very little room for development. There are the Hindus, there are the Muslims, there is a lot of persecution of Christians in India. And so in many Muslim countries, in Indonesia, in Bangladesh, things are improving in Vietnam, in South Korea, but for the rest, there is no real place. But in China, in theory, because as Ian said and as written so many times, there is a real hunger for faith, for religions. People have been deprived of religions for decades and now want a religion. And my impression is that common Chinese people are not really satisfied with the answers they get from Buddhist or Taoist. The recent scandal of the abbot of the Shaolin Temple is one element of many Buddhist abbots which are considered corrupt and not very religious. But Christianity, in all its shapes and forms, is considered more real, I would say. So in theory, there is a lot of potential there.
Ian, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think I think you said that beautifully. I think it's, for a lot of efforts to engage with China right now, it's a difficult time. And I think that the current Pope and the previous Pope or especially the previous Pope, came under a lot of criticism for doing the deal with the Vatican, but I mean, doing the deal with Beijing. I think they're likely to stick with it simply because the previous method probably also hadn't worked that well. And I think probably, as in a lot of things with civil society in China, it's one will have to play the long game and see what happens 5 or 10 years down the road. The Catholic Church has a long experience in playing the long game, so I think they're probably content in doing that, and they probably don't need to rush things or push things any further.
Mm-hmm. Okay, last question, and this is for both of you. Thinking of the long game, 5-10 years ahead, what do you think is likely to happen between China-Vatican relations, but also what would you most like to see happen?
It depends what will happen. It will depend on the international environment, because China in the next 5 years could close even further, could get even more xenophobic, and therefore Christianity could have greater difficulties in general. What I would like to see is, and I honestly pray that, and I try to work for that, but it didn't happen. It would be a trip of the Pope to China, because it's important. It would be important for everybody, I would say, and it would be important also for the world. The Chinese people, but even the Communist Party members would see that the Pope is not such a bad monster. And this Pope has been in China already 6 times. Cardinal Parolin, I think, who was in charge of Chinese affairs, was in China maybe more than a dozen times. So they are both well aware, quite, maybe not well, but quite aware what China is. So their trip could be easier than with Pope Francis, who didn't travel and didn't know China at all.
Okay. Ian, final word.
No, I think I would agree with that. I think the main thing one would hope for the church in China would be also what I would hope for a lot of for China in general, which is that China would return a bit more to the more open, more tolerant society that we saw several decades ago, where the trend lines were somewhat different than they are today. That would be a benefit not only to Catholics, but to other people engaged in other pursuits in China. And I think it would be better for China in the long run, rather than this kind of artificial stability and trying to just keep a lid on things, which I think we know and just doesn't work in the long run. So I would hope that the government, probably not under the current leadership, but maybe in the future, things do change in China. You know, it's a mistake to think that the China of today is the China that will always be like that. That's a mistake we always make about China and about other countries, or just straight line projections and so on. Things have changed dramatically in China over the past 75, 80 years, and I think it could change again. And probably that is the main hope that one can hold out for in the future.
Right, thank you. So ending on a positive note. So I'm afraid, unfortunately, that is all the time we have today, but I want to thank you both very much for sharing your thoughts, your brilliant insights, but also to thank the National Committee staff members behind the scenes who made today's interview possible. And we hope for those of you who have tuned in and found today's interview both interesting and compelling, that you will join us for future National Committee programming. So thank you all again.